Well, hello everybody. From my screen to your house, it's good to be together in this small capacity, but we don't want to cancel everything. We want to at least be together. We think that it's important to have a Sunday morning focus and have an opportunity for people, even if they're all in different areas, to come together around a central focus and still think about what the role is of God in all of these things and all of these moments that are happening. Well, we've been doing a series up till this point on how Jesus and God are kind of easily isolated by us as Christians. We look at Jesus and we think, oh, I'm really good at understanding Jesus, but God seems way out there and I'm not close to God. Or for some people, they're really good at praying to God, but they don't actually get the understanding that Jesus is with them all the time. Jesus walks with them, he talks with them. And they separate those two things. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring those together. We want to see how Jesus and God are one and understand them through some specific stories that we know well, and how we can see God through that and not just Jesus, or Jesus through that and not just God. How do they come together? Well, what we're going to be studying today, the text that we'll be studying is found in Mark 4:35 to 41, and this is the story of God in the storm. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over there to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with them, and a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, he rebuked the winds, and he said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Well, this is a great story, and one that we've heard before. It's in all of the Synoptic Gospels, but I always have appreciated the Mark version the most. There's this moment where Jesus has been teaching and traveling, and he says to the disciples, "Let's get in that boat and let's go to the other side." And when they do, obviously this huge storm comes up. And how does Jesus respond? And how do the disciples respond? Basically, how do we respond when storms come up? Today we're going to be asking ourselves this question. What do we do with storms? And what do we do with fear? Well, the first point and the first thing that we need to look at together today is that storms happen. There's no doubt, storms happen. And when storms happen, the first thing that usually happens is a fear frenzy. People let fear take over, and fear runs rampant. We've all seen it, and today we see it almost at a rate that some of us have never seen it before. People are afraid. And when fear grips them and fear takes over their mindset and their emotions and their feelings, everything else is impacted. I've been to the grocery store and I've seen the lack of toilet paper. People are really afraid. Fear has taken over whole cities these days. Fear is a big thing. Now, the next response usually after the fear frenzy for people and Christians and everybody alike is a crisis of faith. And specifically for Christians, what happens is they basically they get nervous when they're afraid because they know they're afraid. And they think to themselves, if people knew how afraid I was, they would think I was a really bad Christian, basically. They would know I was a bad Christian if they knew how afraid I was. But see, that's not how that works. See, what we already said is that storms happen. Problems come up, and Christians are not exempt. I want to be the first one to tell you, if you have not heard it before, that being a Christian does not take away the problems of life. Problems still come to Christians. Faith and fear are not mutually exclusive. Challenges come up. Cancer happens. Death happens. There's issues around every corner. And in some ways, the bad news about life is that if you're not dealing with an issue now or a storm right now, you're going to be dealing with a storm in the future. Things never stop. Now, I've observed a lot of Christians and a lot of people deal with storms in their life, and I've dealt with my own. And often when I see Christians dealing with struggles and challenges, I see them handle it one of a few different ways. The first is that, just like Peter, when you see the waves and you see the storm coming up all around you, you jump ship. You're too scared. And I've seen a lot of Christians do that. They get too concerned with the waves, and they say, I'm getting out of this boat. I'm going to try to do it on my own. I'm better off swimming. I'm better off alone. But that's not how it works. The next thing is that people forget everything they knew about God. The amount of times that a struggle or concern has come up in someone's life that I've watched unfold, and they forget all the ways that God had ever been with them. They immediately turn to, oh, God's not real, or obviously he doesn't care about me, or obviously he's not with me, and they give up on God. And they forget the times that God has been good to them in the past, that God's been there all along, that God stood by their side and carried them through the struggle. And God always carries people through the struggle. Finally, and quite interestingly, I've seen a lot of people basically abandon the way they felt in the past compared to the way they feel in the future. And what I mean to say is people have thought that God has led them in a direction. And when the storm comes up, they think that whole journey, that whole experience they had is null and not valuable at all. In our church, we just embraced a third campus, and that has been a big thing for us. And we felt that was God's direction for us. We felt that God was in that process and calling us to that. And as leaders, we came together and we made that happen. And we've adopted our third campus in Riverview. But say something terrible happened. Say a moral failure or a huge divide. Would we then automatically assume that God was never a part of it to begin with? Or would we say God has been with us along this process? He's been guiding us in this direction. We don't just forget all the things that happened in the past. We trust that God has been with us to that point. And ironically, in this story, for instance, it was Jesus who actually called the boat to go out into the sea. The next point that I want to make is, in light of all these fears and in light of what is definitely a reality right now in our world, and we don't want to dismiss that to any degree. We recognize that things are serious. The thing I want to say as our next point is Jesus is bigger than the storm. Jesus is bigger than the storm. The most revealing part of the story is, really all of what Jesus does, but when he says, "Why are you so afraid?" And this is a big question. In fact, the statement, "do not be afraid," is the number one command that God gives to his people in Scripture. It's the most prevalent. Do not be afraid. And why does God say, do not be afraid? Because he knows people will get afraid. He knows storms come. He knows that it's inevitable. Well, what does Jesus do in this situation? Well, I said that I liked Mark earlier, and I do like Mark. And Mark, because it comes from Peter as a source, and Mark would have interviewed Peter as part of his process in writing his gospel. It contains a couple little details that aren't in the other synoptics in Matthew and Luke. And one that's really interesting to me is that Jesus was sleeping, but Jesus was sleeping on a pillow. And for some reason, that detail is in there. But what's Jesus doing? He's asleep. He's not freaking out. He's not letting the storm take over his life and the fear grip him and cause him to go into chaos. Jesus wakes up calmly and says, "Why are you so afraid?" And he calms the storm. Jesus is in control, and he deals with the situation. He is not afraid. He was sleeping on a pillow. Well, I guess it would be prudent to say, why is Jesus not afraid? Well, you could say that he's God, or all other number of basic Sunday school arguments. But in truth, the reason that Jesus is not afraid is because he has confidence in his Father. He knows that nothing can ultimately harm him. He knows his future is secure. See, as Christians, nothing can ultimately harm us. I know that the reason people are stressed about the coronavirus is because it creates the opportunity to speed up the most frightening thing about life, and that's death. Everybody's afraid of dying. Whether they let on or not, death is a frightening thing. And even death as Christians is something really important to consider. See, during the time of the bubonic plague, Christians were the first people on the front lines of different areas. They were bringing food to the sick. Why were they doing that? Because they recognized that in Jesus, nothing could ultimately harm them. Even sickness, even death was not the end for them. Early church fathers under the persecution of Rome faced unbelievable suffering. Father Antonio Galeone, in his work, The Torture and Torments of the Christian Martyr, outlines how Christians in the early church were burned alive, crucified, amputated, and exposed to the beasts, among many other horrific tortures. Yet, through the ecclesiastical notes of Eusebius, we see the staunch refusal of Christians to deny Christ so that they may be set free of their torture. See, in those times, people were being tortured in the most obscene and terrible ways imaginable. And yet something remarkable happened. As Christians were walking towards suffering and were being martyred, a growth that nobody could have predicted happened. See, right around this time that all of these people were dying, the church was growing. And how Rome hoped to deter Christianity, they actually grew it. By the year 300, 3 million Christians were in this world. 3 million. In spite of all the killing, in spite of the tortures. These Christians were walking forward, embracing these things, knowing that nothing could ultimately harm them. See, herein lies a huge Christian topic. How do we deal with these things? How do we view death? How do we view crisis? How do we view fear? Are we helpers? Are we the people that make a difference? Are we scared, or are we going to help? Do we calm people down, or do we stress them out? What are we doing to make a difference? And how is God using us? The next thing that, and the last point that we need to make today is that God is with us in the storm. You know, it would be a really good point to end on to say, oh, well, you don't need to worry about death. Heaven is just around the corner. No matter what happens, you'll be fine as a Christian. And I believe that to be true. I believe that heaven is around the corner for Christians. But I don't want to dismiss the reality of the world and dismiss the fear that people have and deal with every day. There's a lot of people who are scared right now, and there's good reason to be scared. And, you know, death is a fearful thing. And I'm not signing up to be tortured like some of those early Christians, and I'm not signing up for plane tickets to go to the countries where Christians are still persecuted to this day. That's not on my list of things to do. But I do recognize that I have a role and that God is with me. See, even if heaven is the ultimate goal, we still deal with fear. But we deal with fear in a different way because we know that God is with us. We don't live our lives alone and secluded. We live our lives with God. So whether heaven is on the way or not, it doesn't really matter. In the day-to-day, God is with us. And that is the ultimate value of a Christian. You don't become a Christian so that you get to go to heaven. You become a Christian because God is with you. And when we know that God is with us, it impacts how we deal with fear. For the disciples, they had God in the boat. Jesus was with them. What was the storm when Jesus was there? See, Jesus is the God who handles the storms. Jesus is the God of the weather. He's the creator of the world. It's Jesus who says, before Abraham was, I am, and who says, I and the Father are one, who in him all things were created, who conquered death and is coming back again to make things right forever. This is the God who says, do not be afraid. And this is the God who is with you in the storm, who is with you today. I want to end by quoting a couple of writers and how they felt about this. Paul, the writer Paul, says, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of peace, of love, and of sound mind. And it's his God who's with him. And it's his God who's with us today. And finally, the writer Isaiah says, so do not fear, for I am with you. And do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, and yes, I will uphold you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Today, as we deal with fear, and as we look at the storm running rampant around us, it's our job to see the waves, to see the storm, but to know that God is with us in the boat. He's with us today, and he never leaves us nor forsakes us. We'll look forward to future videos and future programming, and we'll just ask that you stay updated on our Facebook page. We hope you enjoyed being with us today on Sunday morning, and we look forward to being together again soon.